In Fundy, which are one of the highest in the world, when the big tides would come in, they would have to fight the tides away by building these dikes.
But it was not just the sea that was threatening Acadie. The Acadians had built a prosperous, independent homeland. Fish and game were abundant, their orchards were bountiful, trade with their neighbors was lucrative. Epidemics like smallpox, typhoid, and cholera were unknown in Acadie. They lived as well or better than anyone else in North America. But what the Acadians had, others would soon try to take away.
This is the Minas Basin.
And how many families are in Chignecto?
200 families, sir.
And how many families in Cobequid?
Cobequid.
Ladder up, Acadians, and continue the burning. Sergeant!
Less than 10 years into the colony's existence, Port Royal was burned to the ground by English forces from Virginia. This was only the beginning. The French and British were trading pawns in a deadly game for the possession of North America, with Acadie as the key strategic prize. The colony had changed hands 10 times in the first 100 years of its history before finally being ceded to the British in 1713. It was an uneasy peace, the French ready to retake Acadie, or Nova Scotia as the British called it. The Acadians, however, did not care about the color of the flag that floated over the governor's house.
The Acadians had learned over the years that for a while they might belong to France, and for a while they might belong to England, and then they would return to France, and then they would return to England. They had learned by that experience to not place a whole lot of stock in who owned the colony at any given moment. While they belonged to, during the periods they belonged to England, they didn't stop trading with New France, and during the periods that they belonged to France, they didn't stop trading with New England.
When the British took control of Nova Scotia, many of them wanted to get rid of the Acadians altogether, but they couldn't, not just yet anyway.
The British weren't able to expel the Acadians in 1713 simply because they were dependent upon the Acadians for their source of supply. Acadie was a backwater outpost outside of the main shipping lanes which went to Boston and Quebec. And as a consequence, the cost of maintaining a garrison from either Boston or London would have been extremely high.
So by threats and empty promises, the British spent the next several decades trying to assimilate the Acadians. Each successive governor of Nova Scotia would try to force the Acadians to swear the oath of allegiance to the British crown unconditionally, and always they would refuse.
They learned to be very independent, fiercely independent, and to sort of disregard institutional authority from afar.
Throughout their negotiations with the British, the Acadians insisted on 3 fundamental conditions: the unrestricted right to practice their Catholic religion, full ownership of their land and property, and the exemption from having to bear arms.
They weren't as reluctant to simply pledge allegiance to the British, but they were reluctant to accept all of the factors that came along with that. One of them was that they were going to have to stop speaking French and learn English. Another was that they were likely going to have to change religions, And the most important one, the Acadians, if they were anything, they were profoundly pragmatic. The most important one was that if they became English subjects, they would have to accept to fight against the enemies of the British, which meant that they were going to have to fight against the Micmac Indians who had helped them establish themselves there and with whom they had wonderful relations. And they were going to have to accept to fight against the French.
Attempts to assimilate the Acadians had failed, and the military situation was growing increasingly tense as England and France prepared for yet another war. The neutral Acadians found themselves living between two heavily armed and hostile camps.
Is essentially a flashpoint. It's one of those areas where the two empires come into direct contact, and it's also where military force is brought to bear right on the common boundary line. And it's as a result of this that the area's importance is magnified, especially where the Acadian population was concerned.
It's important to understand when considering this business of the Oath of Allegiance that people often ask, why did the Acadians not sign the Oath of Allegiance? Why they didn't accept it? Well, the British governors were being very careful for a long time, and it's documented that they didn't want the Acadians to take that Oath of Allegiance. They didn't want to deal with that because they didn't want, they were trying to hold off and stave off enough time and not press this issue so that they didn't get the Acadians, getting a bunch of Acadians jumping across the line and going to help the French before the English were well enough established to be able to resist that kind of attack. And it wasn't until Lawrence got there that they finally felt like they had the numbers to protect the colony, and that's when they started to press it. But even then, Lawrence said in several letters, I will present to them one last time the Oath of Allegiance, and they will not sign this, but I will use as a pretext that they had refused it before to not let them sign it. And if they don't sign it, I shall deport them. And if they should figure out a way to accept the terms and sign it, I will deport them anyway. No matter what they did, whether they accepted or not, the plan had already been set into motion to rid the colony of these people.
His solution was nothing less than a complete ethnic cleansing of the country.
Thomas,